She had nothing left to give. Yet when she saw the wounded warrior bleeding into the earth, Mercy Whitmore poured her last drops of water between his cracked lips. By sunset, 700 painted faces would surround her cabin, and her single act of kindness would either save her life or end it, forging a legacy that would echo through generations. The morning sun barely crested the hills when Mercy stepped outside her weathered cabin, clutching the wooden bucket that held her most precious possession, drinkable water. The well had run dry 3 days ago, and this water, murky and warm, was all that stood between her and the perilous journey to the creek, a trek through territory where whispers turned to disappearances. Her bare feet moved carefully across the rocky ground as she inspected the rabbit snares her father had painstakingly taught her to set before the fever stole him away. Empty, as always. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a familiar ache, but she'd learned to coexist with that particular pain. At 16, she'd been alone for 8 months, her existence a daily battle against the encroaching wilderness and the chilling specter of despair. That's when she saw him. The man lay face down near the boundary of her meager claim, his dark hair a tangled mess matted with blood, one arm twisted at an unnatural angle. War paint, smeared and faded, adorned his chest in patterns unfamiliar to her, and a bone-handled knife lay just beyond his grasp. Everything about him screamed of peril, the kind of danger that made grown men clutch their rifles tighter and offer hurried prayers before sleep, the danger whispered around crackling fires. But as Mercy crept closer, a sight pierced through her fear, gripping her chest with an unexpected pang. His breathing came in ragged, desperate gasps. Blood pulsed from a wound in his side, staining the parched earth a gruesome crimson. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin burned with a feverish heat. He was undeniably dying. The rational choice, the choice driven by self-preservation, would be to turn away, to erase his existence from her sight, to let the merciless hand of nature take its course, and avoid the inevitable complications that aiding him would bring crashing down upon her. Her father had constantly warned her about the escalating tensions between the encroaching settlers and the native tribes, about how a single misstep could ignite a conflagration that would consume everything in its path. But Mercy had never been particularly gifted in the art of cold calculation. Driven by an inexplicable impulse, she knelt beside him, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve as she gently tilted his head back. His eyes fluttered open, dark and fierce even in their weakened state. For a fleeting moment, they stared at each other across a chasm forged by generations of misunderstanding and bloodshed, a divide that had claimed countless lives. She fully expected him to recoil in alarm, to instinctively reach for his knife, to perceive her as the enemy. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the bucket in her hands. Without a moment's hesitation, Mercy brought the water to his parched lips, drop by agonizingly precious drop. She watched as it flowed into his mouth, his throat working convulsively to swallow. She used nearly half of what she had left, enough water to sustain her for 2 days if she rationed it carefully, to keep her clinging to life until she could brave the treacherous journey to the creek. When he had drunk his fill, she tore strips from her already threadbare dress to staunch the flow of blood and clean his festering wounds. The gash in his side was deep and angry-looking, but not immediately fatal if treated with proper care. As she meticulously worked, she noticed something that sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. A distinctive, meticulously crafted scar on his shoulder in the unmistakable shape of a lightning bolt, and around his neck, a necklace bearing intricate symbols that marked him as someone of considerable importance, someone whose absence would undoubtedly be noticed and avenged. The warrior's unwavering eyes never left her face as she bandaged his wounds with the last scraps of clean cloth she possessed. When she finished, he'd reached up with his uninjured arm and touched her hand briefly, not as a threat, but in a gesture that felt undeniably like gratitude. Then his eyes closed once more, and his breathing deepened into the steady, rhythmic pattern of healing sleep. Mercy sat back on her heels, suddenly acutely aware of the magnitude of her actions. She had just saved the life of a man whose people were locked in a seemingly endless war with her own, She had sacrificed her last water, her last clean bandages, her last shred of security on someone who might awaken and kill her without a second thought, someone whose very presence on her land could be interpreted as an act of war by any trigger-happy settler who stumbled upon him here. But as she gazed at his peaceful face, she felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in what seemed like an eternity. The warm, flickering ember of having done something purely and unreservedly good in a world that appeared determined to punish goodness at every single turn. That feeling of fragile hope lasted precisely as long as it took her to hear the ominous sound that froze the blood in her veins. The unmistakable thunder of hoofbeats, many of them rapidly approaching across the valley floor, and from the rhythmic cadence, she could discern that they were not the horses of plodding settlers or the heavy mounts of the cavalry. These were the swift, agile steeds of warriors, and they were heading directly for her isolated cabin. Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of impending doom as the thunder of hooves grew louder with each passing second. She glanced down at the unconscious warrior. Akachita. She recalled him whispering the name when she'd offered him water, then at her meager cabin a mere 20 yards away. She would never reach it in time to conceal him, and even if she somehow managed to, the telltale trail of blood would inevitably betray his hiding place. The logical, self-preserving thing to do would be to flee, to vanish into the dense woods behind her cabin and allow whatever was coming to find what it would find. But a stubborn, inexplicable defiance refused to allow her to abandon the man whose life she had just saved. If these riders harbored malicious intentions towards him, her presence might be the only thing standing between him and certain death. The first warrior crested the hill like a phantom conjured from the depths of a nightmare. His horse moved with the sinuous grace of wind rippling across water, and the man himself seemed carved from granite and fueled by pure, unadulterated fury. War paint covered his face in bold, terrifying strokes of crimson and ebony, and feathers fluttered wildly from his long braided hair as he rode. Behind him came another, then another, until the entire hillside seemed to flow with mounted figures, an unstoppable wave of impending violence. 10 warriors, 20, 50. Mercy had never witnessed such a spectacle in one place, had never imagined such a sight was even remotely possible. They moved with unnerving precision, spreading out to encircle her property like water flowing around an immovable stone. Their horses snorted and stamped impatiently, their hooves tearing at the earth, but the riders themselves remained motionless as death, their piercing eyes meticulously scanning every inch of her land, seeking any sign of threat or deception. The lead warrior, a man whose commanding presence radiated authority even from a considerable distance, raised his hand in a gesture of absolute command, and the entire war party halted as a single, unified entity. His penetrating gaze found Mercy instantly, kneeling beside Akachita with incriminating blood staining her hands and raw, primal fear etched across her face. For an agonizingly long moment, nobody moved. Mercy felt the palpable weight of 100 pairs of eyes boring into her, each one meticulously calculating her perceived threat level, her underlying intentions, her very chances of survival. She could smell the musky scent of the horses, hear the creak of worn leather and the mournful whisper of wind rustling through feathers. The very air thrummed with a tension so thick and suffocating it felt almost solid. Then the lead warrior dismounted with a fluid, almost predatory grace. He was noticeably older than the others, with streaks of silver threading through his long, meticulously braided hair, and scars adorning his arms like a roadmap of battles weathered and survived. When he walked, the earth itself seemed to acknowledge his presence, vibrating with the weight of his authority. This was a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, to having his every word treated as unassailable law. Behind him, the other warriors remained mounted, their bodies coiled and ready for action, their hands resting menacingly on weapons that could extinguish her life in a heartbeat. As he approached, Mercy noticed something that made her stomach clench with a fresh wave of chilling fear. The lightning bolt scar emblazoned on his shoulder was an exact replica of Akachita's, and the intensity with which his eyes focused on the unconscious warrior told her everything she needed to know about their relationship. This wasn't merely a war party searching for a missing warrior. This was a grieving father desperately searching for his beloved son. The chief stopped a mere 3 feet away from her, close enough for her to discern the profound pain etched behind his fierce expression. His gaze shifted from Akachita's expertly bandaged wounds to the empty water bucket discarded beside Mercy, to the torn strips of her dress that now served as makeshift dressings. When he looked back at her face, she glimpsed a flicker of something entirely unexpected. Confusion. He spoke then, his voice carrying the weight and authority of thunder rolling across the plains. Words in a language she didn't understand but whose meaning seemed unequivocally clear. A question, a demand for explanation. But before Mercy could even attempt to formulate a response, something shifted in the air around them, a subtle change that heralded impending disaster. More hoofbeats, this time approaching from the opposite direction. The warriors tensed immediately, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons, their horses sidling nervously. These new riders were not painted for war. They wore the unmistakable blue uniforms of the cavalry, and they were rapidly approaching. The chief's head snapped towards the sound of the approaching cavalry with a movement so swift it was almost violent, and in that instant, Mercy saw the entire situation explode into something far beyond her capacity to control. The warriors behind him shifted like a flock of birds sensing the approach of a predator, weapons materializing in their hands with deadly efficiency. What had been a tense but potentially manageable encounter was about to devolve into a full-blown massacre, with her helplessly caught in the middle. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising chaos, then louder with growing desperation. "No!" In a desperate act of defiance, she threw herself across Akachita's unconscious form, spreading her arms wide as if her small, fragile body could somehow shield him from the impending storm. The chief's eyes widened in undisguised surprise at her actions, genuine astonishment flickering across his weathered features. In all his years of warfare, he had clearly never encountered a settler willing to sacrifice herself to protect one of his people. The cavalry emerged from the tree line like a blue tide of righteous indignation. 12 soldiers led by a fresh-faced lieutenant whose youthful exuberance marked him as someone who still clung to the naive belief that war could be clean and simple. When he saw the war party surrounding Mercy's cabin, his hand went immediately to the hilt of his saber. "Stand down!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with a mixture of authority and barely concealed nervousness. "Release the girl and withdraw from this territory immediately." The chief turned slowly, his movements deliberate and laden with unspoken menace. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but perfectly clear, betraying years spent navigating the treacherous landscape of intercultural relations. "We take what is ours." "That girl is under the protection of the United States Army," the lieutenant retorted, though Mercy noticed his hand trembling noticeably on his weapon. "Any harm to her will be considered an act of war." A cold, mirthless smile touched the corners of the chief's lips. "War?" He gestured expansively towards his warriors, who seemed to multiply in the morning light as more and more emerged from positions Mercy hadn't even known they occupied. "You bring 12 boys to speak of war." The lieutenant's face visibly paled as he began to realize the gravity of the situation, something that Mercy was only beginning to fully comprehend. This wasn't a random, unfortunate encounter. The war party hadn't simply stumbled upon Akachita here. They had been meticulously tracking him, following a trail that led unerringly to her doorstep. And now they were face to face with exactly the kind of volatile confrontation that had sparked the bloody conflicts her father had so fervently warned her about. "There's been a misunderstanding," Mercy called out, her voice surprisingly strong and clear despite the tremor of fear that coursed through her veins. Both groups of men turned to regard her, and she realized with a chilling sense of clarity that she might be the only person present who genuinely didn't want the bloodshed to begin. "I helped him. He was hurt, and I gave him water." "You?" The lieutenant's voice rose incredulously. "You aided a hostile warrior?" "He was dying," she replied simply, her gaze unwavering. The chief studied her face intently, as if attempting to decipher something profound written there in a language he was only beginning to understand. He spoke again in his own tongue, a rapid burst of words that elicited murmurs of surprise and speculation from several of his warriors. Then he looked down at Akachita, his eyes lingering on the careful way his wounds had been dressed, the discarded clean water bucket, the strips of cloth that had clearly been torn from the girl's own clothing. But before anyone could formulate a response to this revelation, Akachita's eyes fluttered open. The young warrior's gaze shifted from his father's face to the soldiers arrayed behind him, to Mercy, who was still kneeling protectively beside him. When he attempted to sit up, a wave of excruciating pain made him gasp, but he stubbornly forced himself upright anyway. He spoke to his father in urgent, hushed tones, gesturing towards Mercy with his good arm. The chief's expression subtly shifted as he listened intently to his son's words. The hard lines etched around his eyes softened slightly, and when he looked at Mercy again, there was something distinctly different in his gaze, something that might have been construed as respect. "My son says you gave him life," the chief said slowly, carefully choosing his words. "Says you used your last water when you had nothing." "Anyone would have done the same," Mercy replied, though they all knew with a chilling certainty that it simply wasn't true. The lieutenant, growing increasingly agitated and frustrated by this conversation he couldn't understand or control, took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I don't care what she did. She's a settler under military protection, and I'm ordering you to—" The chief's hand moved with lightning quickness to his tomahawk, the polished steel glinting menacingly in the morning light. "You order nothing here, boy." The morning air crackled with the palpable electricity of imminent violence. Weapons were being drawn on both sides, horses snorting and shifting nervously, men's faces settling into the grim, determined masks they wore before the killing began. And in the very center of it all, Mercy realized with a sinking feeling that her single act of kindness had created a knot so tangled and complex that it might only be untied with a torrent of blood, the tension stretched taut as a bowstring about to snap. Mercy could see fingers tightening on triggers, hands shifting to more secure weapon grips, horses sensing their riders' readiness for violence. In mere seconds, her small, isolated patch of land would be transformed into a brutal battlefield, and everyone present seemed willing to die for principles and ideologies she didn't fully comprehend. Except Akachita. The wounded warrior, fueled by an almost superhuman determination, struggled to his feet, swaying precariously but refusing his father's outstretched, steadying hand. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the clearing with surprising strength and resonance, each word carefully chosen in English so that everyone present could understand its meaning. "She is under my protection now." The unexpected statement landed like a thunderbolt. The lieutenant's jaw visibly dropped in stunned disbelief. Several warriors shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Even the chief seemed momentarily taken aback by his son's audacious declaration. In the deeply ingrained culture of the Lakota, such a pronouncement carried the full weight of law, irrevocably binding the speaker to defend the protected person with his life, regardless of the cost. "You can't do that," the lieutenant sputtered, his face a mask of incredulity. "She's a citizen of—" "She gave me life when she could have let me die," Akachita continued, completely ignoring the sputtering soldier, his unwavering gaze fixed intently on his father. "The spirits brought me to her door for a reason. She has earned the right to walk safely among our people." The chief's face was unreadable, an impenetrable mask of stoicism, but Mercy could sense the internal conflict raging behind his eyes. This was his son, the heir to leadership of their band, making a decision that could irrevocably alter the delicate balance of power in the entire territory, but it was also a decision deeply rooted in honor, in the ancient traditions that demanded debts be repaid, regardless of the consequences. "And what of them?" The chief nodded curtly towards the cavalry. "They will not understand our ways." It was then that Mercy made a decision that surprised everyone present, including herself. She stood slowly, positioning herself deliberately between the two opposing groups, and spoke with a clarity and conviction that cut through the oppressive tension of the morning air. "I choose to go with them." Every eye turned to focus on her. The lieutenant looked horrified. Several warriors muttered amongst themselves in confused disbelief. But Akachita smiled slightly, as if he had somehow been expecting precisely this response all along. "Miss, you can't seriously be considering," the lieutenant began, his voice laced with desperation. "I am," Mercy said firmly, her voice unwavering. "I helped Akachita because it was the right thing to do. If that means I need to answer for it to his people, then that's precisely what I'll do." She looked directly at the chief, her gaze unwavering. "But I will not be the reason men die today. If my going with you prevents bloodshed, then that's where I belong." The chief studied her for what felt like an eternity, his weathered features revealing nothing of his thoughts or intentions. Around them, the warriors waited with unwavering patience for his final decision, while the cavalry fidgeted nervously in their saddles, their hands still gripping their weapons. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows that seemed to divide the world into stark, uncompromising lines of light and dark. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice resonating with the weight of absolute authority. "You would trust your life to people you have been taught to fear?" "I would trust my life to people who understand honor," Mercy replied, her gaze unwavering. "Your son could have killed me when I helped him. Instead, he offered protection. That tells me everything I need to know about your people." The lieutenant made one last, desperate attempt to assert his authority. "I cannot allow a civilian to leave with a hostile war party. My orders." "Your orders," the chief interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of winter's icy grip, "mean nothing here." He turned to face Mercy, and for the first time, something that might have been genuine respect flickered in his eyes. "If you come willingly, you will be treated with honor. But know this, once you cross into our territory, there may be no returning to this world." Mercy felt the weight of the momentous choice settling heavily on her shoulders. Behind her lay everything familiar, her humble cabin, her hard-won land, the life she had painstakingly built from the ashes of her family's shattered dreams. Ahead lay the unknown, a people whose ways she didn't understand, and the very real possibility that she might never see another sunrise. But as she looked at Akachita, still swaying slightly on his feet but standing tall and proud despite his grievous wounds, she realized something that surprised her. For the first time in months, she wasn't entirely alone. The chief raised his hand, and one of his warriors immediately brought forward a magnificent painted horse, its coat gleaming iridescently in the morning sun. The animal was undeniably beautiful, clearly bred for both speed and endurance, with intelligent eyes that seemed to appraise Mercy as carefully as its rider did. "You will ride with honor," the chief said, assisting her as she mounted the horse. His hands were surprisingly gentle, and she caught a fleeting glimpse of something paternal in his expression. "My name is Tatanka. You saved my son's life. That debt will not be forgotten." As Mercy settled onto the horse's back, she heard the lieutenant calling out behind them, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "This is a mistake! When word reaches Fort Collins, there will be consequences. The army will come looking for her." Tatanka turned in his saddle, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Let them come. They will find only what the wind tells them." The war party began to move, flowing like water around Mercy's position, drawing her into their midst. She found herself surrounded but not trapped, protected rather than captured. Akachita rode beside her despite his lingering wounds, his presence a source of quiet strength and reassurance in a world that had suddenly become utterly foreign. As they crested the first hill, Mercy glanced back to see her cabin receding in the distance, growing smaller with each passing moment. The lieutenant and his men remained where she had left them, their blue uniforms stark against the brown earth. She wondered if she would ever see that little house again, ever sleep in the bed her father had built with his own hands. But then, Akachita spoke softly beside her, drawing her back to the present. "You showed great courage back there. Not many would have chosen as you did." "I didn't really have a choice," she replied. "Not if I wanted to live with myself afterward." He nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "My father will want to know more about you, why you helped me, why you chose to come with us rather than hide behind the soldiers' protection." Mercy considered this as they rode deeper into territory she had never seen before. The landscape was beautiful in a stark and unforgiving way, all rolling hills and scattered trees with mountains rising majestically in the distance like the very backbone of the world. She had always thought of this as empty land, dangerous and wild, but seeing it through the eyes of the warriors around her, she began to understand that it was anything but empty. It was home. "What should I tell him?" she asked. "The truth," Akachita said simply. "My people value honesty above all else. If you speak from your heart, he will hear it." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the horses moving with the easy rhythm of animals bred for long journeys. Around them, the warriors maintained their alert watchfulness. But there was something different about their demeanor now. They no longer looked at her as a potential threat, but rather as someone under their protection. What Mercy discovered at their destination would challenge everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and what it truly means to belong somewhere. It was midday when they reached the edge of the tribal lands, and Mercy's breath caught in her throat. Spread across the valley below was a sight that no settler had ever lived to describe, a massive encampment that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Hundreds of lodges dotted the landscape like giant flowers, smoke rising lazily from countless fires. The sound that reached her ears was unlike anything she had ever heard. The voices of children playing, women singing, dogs barking, horses nickering. It was the sound of a living, breathing community, vibrant and full of life. 700 warriors, Tatanka said, noting her stunned expression, and their families. Nearly 3,000 people who call this place home. Mercy felt her mouth go dry. She had heard estimates of tribal numbers from traders and soldiers, but seeing the reality was something else entirely. This wasn't the small, scattered group she had imagined. This was a nation. "And they all know about me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Akachita's smile was enigmatic. "News travels fast here. By now everyone knows that a settler girl gave her last water to save a warrior's life. They're curious to meet someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to make such a choice." As they began their descent into the valley, Mercy realized that her real test was just beginning. The morning's confrontation with the cavalry seemed simple compared to what lay ahead, earning the trust and respect of 3,000 people who had every reason to see her as their enemy. The procession into the camp was unlike anything Mercy could have imagined. As word spread of their arrival, people emerged from their lodges like flowers opening to the sun. Children ran alongside the horses, their laughter bright and curious. Women paused in their work to watch, some with suspicion, others with frank interest. Warriors nodded respectfully to Tatanka, but their eyes were all on the pale girl riding beside his wounded son. Mercy felt the weight of hundreds of stares, each one carrying questions she couldn't answer. Her worn dress, patched and faded, seemed shabby compared to the beautifully decorated clothing around her. The intricate beadwork, the rich colors of painted hides, the elegant braiding of hair adorned with feathers and shells. It was a level of artistry that made her feel like a sparrow among eagles. But what struck her most was something she hadn't expected: the children. They looked just like children everywhere, curious, playful, full of life. Some hung back shyly behind their mother's skirts, while others boldly reached out to touch her horse as they passed, their laughter universal, needing no translation. Tatanka led them to the center of the camp, where the largest lodge stood, decorated with symbols that seemed to tell stories in a language of paint and hide. As they dismounted, an elderly woman emerged from this central dwelling. Her hair was silver white, braided with ornaments that caught the light, and her face held the kind of wisdom that came from seeing many seasons pass. When she looked at Mercy, the girl felt as though she was being measured for something far more important than clothes. "This is Winona," Tatanka said. "She is the keeper of our stories, the one who remembers what must not be forgotten. She will decide if your actions have earned you a place among us." Winona approached slowly, her gaze never leaving Mercy's face. When she spoke, her English was precise and careful, as if each word had been chosen for its exact weight. "You gave water to my grandson when you had little for yourself." "Yes," Mercy replied simply. You knew he was Lakota. You knew the danger. Yes. Yet you chose to help him anyway. Mercy nodded, unsure what else to say. The old woman continued to study her, and the entire camp seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her judgment. Finally, Winona smiled, an expression that transformed her weathered features into something beautiful. Then you understand something that many do not, that kindness recognizes no boundaries, that mercy knows no tribe. She stepped forward and placed her hands on Mercy's shoulders. You will stay in my lodge tonight. Tomorrow, when the sun rises, you will choose. Return to your people with our blessing and our protection, or remain here and learn our ways. But know this, whatever you choose, you will always be welcome at our fires. The crowd around them began to disperse, people returning to their daily tasks, but with a new energy, a buzz of conversation about the unprecedented events of the day. Mercy felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming uncertainty. She had been accepted, at least temporarily, but the weight of the choice ahead pressed down on her like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. As Winona led her towards the lodge, Mercy caught sight of Akachita being helped away by two other warriors. Before he disappeared from view, he turned back and caught her eye. His nod was slight but unmistakable, a promise that whatever happened next, she wouldn't face it alone. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mercy couldn't shake the feeling that something was building on the horizon. Something that would test not just her courage, but the fragile peace that her act of kindness had created. The lodge was larger inside than it appeared from the outside, with buffalo hides stretched over wooden poles, creating a space that felt both intimate and grand. Painted symbols covered the walls, animals, celestial bodies, and geometric patterns that seemed to dance in the flickering light of the central fire. Winona moved with practiced efficiency, preparing food and bedding while sharing stories that helped Mercy understand the world she had entered. My people have lived on this land for generations beyond counting, the old woman said as she worked. We know every stream, every hunting ground, every sacred place. But lately, more settlers come each season, and with them, soldiers who see only empty land to be claimed. Mercy listened, beginning to understand the deeper currents that had brought her to this moment. Her own family had been part of that westward push, seeking opportunity in a place that others already called home. The realization brought with it a complicated mix of guilt and understanding. Your son, Akachita, he was scouting near settler territory when he was wounded? She asked. Winona's hands paused in their work. He was returning from a peace mission. Some of our young warriors grow restless, speak of driving out all settlers before more arrive. Akachita went to speak with the chiefs of neighboring bands to urge patience, to seek a path that doesn't lead to war. The weight of this revelation settled over Mercy like a blanket. She had saved the life of a peacemaker, someone working to prevent the very conflicts that terrified settlers like herself. But she had also learned something else. War was closer than she had realized, balanced on a knife's edge that could tip either way. As evening deepened, the sounds of the camp began to change. The laughter of children gave way to the low murmur of adult conversation, the crackle of fires, and something else. A rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. They're telling the story of what happened today, Winona explained, seeing Mercy's curious expression. Your story, how a settler girl chose compassion over fear, how she rode willingly into danger rather than see blood spilled. Such stories become part of our history, passed down through generations. Mercy felt overwhelmed by the thought. I just did what anyone should do. But few would, Winona replied gently. That's what makes it worth remembering. As they prepared for sleep, a commotion outside caught their attention. Voices were raised in urgent discussion, and through the lodge's entrance, Mercy could see warriors gathering around fires, their faces grim in the dancing light. What's happening? She asked. Before Winona could answer, Tatanka's voice called from outside. Winona, bring the girl. She needs to hear this. They emerged to find the chief standing with several other warriors, all of them wearing expressions that made Mercy's stomach clench with dread. When Tatanka spoke, His words carried the weight of impending doom. "Riders came from the east. The lieutenant who wanted to take you back. He has returned to Fort Collins and told his commander that we captured a settler woman. They're calling it an act of war." Mercy felt the blood drain from her face. "But I came willingly. I chose to come here." "They don't care about choice," another warrior said bitterly. "They see only what serves their purpose, a reason to bring soldiers into our lands." Tatanka continued, his voice heavy with the burden of leadership. "They're gathering forces, not just from Fort Collins, but from 3 other military posts. By tomorrow's end, we could face 500 soldiers demanding your return." The implications crashed over Mercy like a cold wave. Her act of kindness, meant to prevent bloodshed, had instead provided the excuse for exactly the kind of large-scale conflict everyone had been trying to avoid. The young lieutenant's wounded pride had escalated a simple misunderstanding into a potential massacre. "I have to go back," she said immediately. "I have to tell them the truth." "It may be too late for truth," Winona said sadly. "When men want war, they find ways to justify it." Akachita appeared at the edge of the firelight, his wounds freshly dressed, but his steps still uncertain. "There's something else," he said grimly. "Our scouts report that some of our own young warriors are using this as a call to arms. They say the time for peace has passed, that we should strike first before the soldiers can organize." Mercy realized with growing horror that she stood at the center of forces spiraling beyond anyone's control. Her single act of compassion had become the catalyst for exactly the kind of devastating conflict that both sides had been dreading, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, armies were gathering that would arrive with the dawn. Dawn broke gray and ominous, with storm clouds gathering on both horizons, literal ones in the sky and human ones on the plains. Mercy stood with Tatanka and his council, watching as dust clouds marked the approach of the cavalry from the east, while war parties of young Lakota warriors assembled to the west. Between them lay a valley that would soon become a battlefield unless someone found a way to pull back from the brink. 500 soldiers, a scout reported breathlessly, led by a colonel who's never lost a battle. They carry cannons. "Our young warriors number 300, with more arriving from allied bands," another voice added. "They paint their faces for war and sing death songs." Mercy felt the weight of impending catastrophe pressing down on her shoulders. Everything she had tried to prevent was about to happen on a scale that would echo through history. But as she watched the two forces converging, an idea began to form, desperate, dangerous, but perhaps their only hope. "Let me go to them," she said suddenly, breaking the stunned silence. Tatanka shook his head immediately. "You would be killed before you spoke 10 words. Soldiers in battle mood see only enemies." "Not if I carry something they can't ignore," Mercy replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "A flag of truce, and proof that I was never captured." She turned to face the assembled council, her heart racing but her voice steady. "Give me Akachita and a small escort. Let us ride to the middle ground between the armies. When both sides see that he's alive and I'm unharmed, when they hear the truth of what really happened, maybe reason can still prevail." "And if it doesn't?" Winona asked quietly. "Then at least we'll have tried something other than violence first." The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Akachita, still weak but determined, mounted his horse beside Mercy. 5 warriors rode with them, carrying white cloth that caught the morning wind like prayers made visible. As they crossed the valley floor toward the space between the armies, Mercy could feel hundreds of eyes watching their progress. The cavalry had formed battle lines, their blue uniforms stark against the brown earth. But when they saw the small party approaching under a flag of truce, discipline held. Officers raised spyglasses, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. When they reached the midpoint, Mercy dismounted and walked forward alone. Her voice, when she called out, carried clearly across the valley. "I am Mercy Whitmore. I was never captured. I came here willingly to prevent bloodshed, and I'm here now for the same reason." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a single rider broke from the cavalry lines. The young lieutenant from the day before, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "You were coerced," he shouted. his voice trembling with indignation. "Threatened into saying these things?" "I was shown more kindness by these people than I've known in months," Mercy replied, her voice ringing with conviction. "They fed me, sheltered me, and protected me. The only threat to my safety is the war you're about to start." The colonel in command rode forward, his weathered face skeptical but listening intently. Behind him, Mercy could see soldiers murmuring among themselves, their certainty beginning to waver. Akachita joined her then, his presence a living testament to her words. "I was dying when she found me," he called out in clear English. "She gave me her last water, her last food, her last bandages. She saved my life when she could have let me die." The colonel studied them both for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he began to smile. "Well, I'll be damned," he said finally. The dawn of a new era had begun. 3 months later, Mercy stood in the doorway of a new cabin, built where 3 territories met, a place where settlers, soldiers, and Lakota could trade safely under the protection of the unprecedented agreement that had grown from that morning in the valley. Akachita, fully healed, worked beside her father-in-law Tatanka to establish the trading post that would serve as neutral ground for all peoples. The young lieutenant had been reassigned to a desk job back east, a fate he considered worse than death. The colonel had been promoted for his role in preventing a war, and Mercy had found something she had never expected, a family that crossed all the boundaries people said couldn't be crossed. But most importantly, she had learned that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of history, if you're brave enough to see them through to the end. So ultimately, Mercy's story reminds us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable differences, a single act of compassion, a willingness to see the humanity in the other, can spark hope and forge connections where we least expect them. It's a testament to the power of kindness to transcend fear, prejudice, and even generations of conflict. It proves that even when we feel we have nothing left to give, the simple act of extending a hand can ripple outwards, creating a legacy that truly changes the world. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Mercy's choices and the themes of compassion and bridging divides in this story. Please, share your comments and questions below. Let's get a conversation going. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Mercy's world and want to explore more inspiring stories with me, don't forget to subscribe. That way you won't miss our future explorations of history and humanity. Thanks for watching.